just I want to move on straight away to letting the speakers talk. So I'll just very briefly just do some housekeeping. So we've got some, so basically the way this event will work is we'll have a sort of brief introduction from our speakers, explaining what they see from their perspective is the consequences of COVID for the London housing crisis, and then that will take about 5-10 minutes for each of them. Although, sorry, I do have to say, Abina has to leave before the start, so I think plan is for her to speak a bit longer, and then we'll break up into groups, maybe 2 groups of about 10 people, maybe 3 groups. I think actually 3 groups would probably be better, to discuss amongst each other what the response should be after hearing the speakers, and then we'll come back together, share what our thoughts were, and let the speakers sort of react to that. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome the MP for Erith and Thamesmead, Abina Opongasare, and who's also a member of the Select Committee for Local Government and Housing, and to sort of say what the situation is from a sort of national sort of level. So yeah, please.
Hi, thanks Philip for organising this and the rest of Open Labour. I think this is a really good event to have because there's a big issue at the moment with the housing crisis because of COVID. So as before, I quickly say my name is Abina Opongasare. I'm a newly elected MP. As Phil said, I represent Erith and Thamesmead. I'm also PPS to Annalise Dodds, and I sit on the Housing, Communities and Local Government Committee. And when I was mentioning, I'll be saying HCLG. So yeah. I'd say that from a personal perspective, housing is something that I've always been interested in. My main priorities that I'm looking to do during this term is to look at social housing and also real affordable housing as well. I thought I'll just quickly talk about the perspective on the crisis at the moment. As we know, obviously we're currently going through COVID, and I'll say that is exacerbated a lot on the housing situation. So the crisis has raised a lot of important issues regarding renters, and then homelessness, and the role of local authorities and affording housing plans. Through my work on the HCLG committee, I've been scrutinising the government on what plans they have to protect the most vulnerable across the crisis. And I've also been doing this as a local MP in my constituency. I'd say when it comes to homelessness, rough sleepers are some of the most vulnerable people in our society. I'll say that is because, the reason I say that is because prolonged rough sleeping basically causes significant impacts on mental and physical well-being, and it also it increases a person's chances of being a victim of crime and violence. And as we know, the streets have become really dangerous. I'd also like to say that, you know, renters are most likely to suffer from immediate economic impacts following COVID crisis compared to homeowners. And I'll give you some stats on that. So what we're seeing right now is less than half rents are being collected on time. So I'd say around 1.7 million of 11 million private renters might be unemployed by the end of July. And that to me is really alarming. In HLG, we've recently published a report and making recommendations to the government. And I thought I'd just quickly outline those six of the key measures that we've recommended, which we feel will protect like rough sleepers and renters. So the first one is one that I guess we'll all kind of share, is that essentially the government should try and end rough sleeping in England, like just basically once and for all. Wouldn't that be ideal? So we've estimated that, like, for this to be able to happen, the government must really properly estimate the cost of like having a proper housing-led solution, which looks at having like appropriate wraparound support, which I think is likely to be about 100 million a year, and this should include private providing dedicated funding streams to councils, because it's really the councils that are doing a lot of the groundwork when it comes to providing housing. And I've seen through this crisis how a lot of councils have basically, essentially been delivering providing support to residents to help them meet their housing needs. The second is basically that the government should basically compensate councils for provisions offered to rough sleepers and those with no recourse to public funds, which has exacerbated during this crisis. So currently there isn't clear guidance in terms of making sure that councils meet those criteria, and it's basically up to council's discretion in terms of how they use it in circumstances. And I feel that there needs to be clear clarification on what people can and can't claim when they have no recourse to public funds. I've seen how, so I've got two councils in my constituency. So I've got Bexley, which is Conservative run, and I've got Labour, which is, so I've got Greenwich, which is Labour run. I've seen how the Labour run council has, gone out above and beyond to help those individuals that have no recourse to public funds. I've seen how Bexley have basically tried to, change with the circumstances and clarification in terms of whether it's appropriate when really they should be doing it. And I just feel that if there was clear guidance, there will be no getaway from kind of whether you're going to deliver those services. The next one is that the government basically needs to act to boost availability of appropriate supported housing. So that means by providing targeted grant funding for councils and the housing associations, which basically allows them to acquire properties using the National Clearing Housing Scheme from 2008 as a starting point. So we're asking the government to essentially remove restrictions on right to buy receipts, which we feel will give councils greater flexibility. I feel that the current housing legislation also really needs to be amended by the government, because I feel that their plans to introduce what they're saying is a pre-action protocol to private renter sector won't really work, because it wouldn't stop like evictions happening once the crisis is over. So one of the key things that we're recommending is the government amends the 1985 Housing Act to allow judges to use discretion under Section 21 and mandatory ground 8 of Section 8, where a tenant in a rent arrears is in rent arrears due to the COVID crisis. And essentially the government just basically needs to bring a bill in as soon as possible to kind of address these. So in terms of what they could be doing in the bill, I think that the government needs to accelerate the introduction to the Renters Reform Bill to Parliament and abolish no-fault evictions, which is under Section 21 of the Housing Act in 1988, and they need to do it within the next 12 months. Then I just thought that I'll just quickly summarise by saying, like, with this report that we've done, we've actually asked the government to respond by tomorrow so that we can make sure that these recommendations are implemented urgently. I mean, the government is looking to start easing lockdown quite soon, and it's so important that they act really quickly, particularly as when it comes to, rough sleepers. I'm really concerned, about this. The government was able to quickly act when COVID started, providing support to rough sleepers. I say that Sadiq Khan also did quite a bit of work on that. And quite a number of these individuals have been put in hotels. Once lockdown eases, those hotels are going to want their rooms back. And another thing that I'm particularly concerned about is it'll be local authorities that will be dealing with the brunt of this, let's be honest with this, who have spent so much money during the COVID crisis, providing additional support, wraparound support to individuals. The stats are saying that councils are basically facing about a 10 billion funding gap. I think it's unrealistic to basically ask councils to not only protect rough sleepers, but also to provide support on no recourse to public funds without any additional government funding going forward. I wanted to give you some stats of the situation that we're dealing. So figures on rent collection from April found that only 44% of residential rent was collected on time, whereas in 2019, that average was 79%. Let's just go back to that 44% in a comparison to 79%. That is deeply, deeply concerning. We are going to be heading to a situation where so many people are going to be unemployed, likely to be unemployed due to this crisis, which will lead to homelessness, which is why we need urgent measures put in place to stop this from happening. Another concern that I have is about social housing. I have regarding the impact of COVID-19, particularly with the effects of COVID-related measures that the government is introducing. Just this Monday, which was a few days ago, I asked the Housing Minister, Chris Pincher, if an analysis had been done into the impacts of the advice that councils should offer deferrals for Section 106 planning obligations on the delivery of social housing. It was really worrying to hear Chris say, no, we have not. And then one of the things that his response was that there was a lot of focus, particularly in his response, about helping SMEs throughout the crisis, which of course I do think is important, but it's clear that to me that the government has not made considerations regarding social housing when implementing new advice. And I know that I feel it's very much focused on just getting the economy on the ground, but they really need to be looking at social housing. So I don't see it as one of their main priorities in terms of addressing this. When I asked him if he was going to even do a review on this, he said he would look into it, but it isn't something that he would consider spending a lot of time or money on, and wouldn't provide me any detailed answers when I pressed him. I have spoken to my local councils who have said to me that they need extra government funding to be able to focus on social and affordable housing. And I know that's the case with other local authorities that I've spoken to. And for me, if this is not the issue, if this issue is not like a government priority, then when funding is restricted due to economic pressures post-COVID, I'm concerned that funding needed for local authorities is not being picked up. And I see us heading to a situation where local authorities, if I'm going to be honest, mainly Labour local authorities, are going to be picking up the slack when it comes to looking at the housing situation. And obviously, because we're talking about London here, and obviously Sadiq Khan as well. So yeah, I just wanted to conclude on that point.
Thank you. Thanks so much. That's actually it's an even worse situation than I imagined. And well, I guess the next I think probably the next speaker that would probably can give us a view of, you know, as you said, councils are having to deal with the flack of this, is Councillor Sem Moema from Hackney, and she's also the Mayor of Hackney's advisor on housing, and also candidate for the North East, is it, constituency for the GLA?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. All right. So yeah,
thanks for having me. So as Phil said, my name is Sem, and I am a member of the cabinet in Hackney. I am the advisor on private rented sector and affordability. And I guess the first thing to say is, in the context of London and Hackney specifically, this is a role which basically exists because of the housing crisis, and because of the housing crisis driven by the unaffordability of the private rented sector in particular, which drives much of the homelessness and the increases in people on our housing waiting lists. And I'm sure for Abena and others in your boroughs, it's much the same. Most people that are on our housing lists are working. And I'm also the candidate for North East, which is the London Assembly constituency, which covers Hackney, Islington and Waltham Forest. So I hope that if any of you are members in any of those three boroughs, I hope to see you on the campaign trail when COVID restrictions are lifted, obviously. But just very quickly, I'm probably going to touch a little bit on Black Lives Matters indirectly, just in the context of housing, because I think that's actually probably quite important. So just in terms of a bit of a borough outline, so Hackney, we have about 111,000 homes. About a third of those, slightly less, sorry, my math is not great, I'll say. So about 34,000 of the homes in Hackney are in the private rented sector. And unlike many other boroughs, we still do have a significant amount of council-owned social housing stock. It's about just under 20% of our stock. The rest of it is either owned by registered providers, so housing associations, I might refer to them as RPs, or private or owner occupied. So a growing but significant number of people are in our private rented sector, and they are people who not that long ago would have probably lived in council housing, or would have lived in registered provider housing, but there is obviously a lack of social housing, which we've lost over a number of years, partly through right to buy and other things. In terms of the cost of living, and obviously for many people, the cost of renting and the cost of a home is the biggest expense that anybody will have day to day, month to month. And I suppose unlike somebody who owns their own property, somebody who's renting, your costs go up every year. So just by way of example, in Hackney as a borough, over the last 20 years, property values have gone up 472%, and private rents have gone up by 47%, so almost 50%. And I don't need to tell you that wages have not kept up with that. So there is a growing and a very, very acute problem around the affordability of the private rented sector for low to middle income households, the people that we clap every Thursday who to work and remain in our borough, who are really the fabric of our borough. And they include people that work for the council as well. So it's kind of thinking about people who live and work in the borough. And so in terms of the work that I do, I'll actually probably start with the coronavirus. So before coronavirus, we had a build program which was on site, and we still do have that in place, but obviously that has been suspended. We do a lot of boroughs build housing in different ways. We build our own council housing. We do that on sites that we own, on land that we own. So in the ward that I represent, Hackney Downs, we have a development on the Nightingale estate of new homes, which is a mixture of genuinely affordable social rent homes, shared ownership homes, because we also have a crisis of affordability in homes for people to buy. And we have a number of homes which are built to be sold to then generate income for us to be able to reinvest in yet more social housing. And that's partly as a function of the government not basically providing enough funding through austerity, and I imagine probably beyond. So through coronavirus, in terms of the work that we have done, and some of it was from the Coronavirus Act, obviously we have suspended all evictions. We've been working really hard So officers and I in my portfolio have been working really hard with private landlords. We've been reaching out to them directly. And I appreciate that sometimes it is not the way that some people within the labour movement would kind of welcome, but our approach is a mixture of carrot and stick. So we will speak to landlords, but also estate agents who have a massive role to play, and encourage them to be aware of their responsibilities in light of the guidance, and when landlords, or quite honestly, most often agencies, are evicting people, we will intervene where we can and try to make sure that people are not evicted. And I'm really pleased to say that so far that has happened. We've actually worked with, I don't know if there is the person from the London Renters Union here, but I think there was a piece of work that we did with supporting some residents of a privately rented building in Stoke Newington. Some of you may know Stoke Newington, Shacklewell area. And that was obviously a very complex piece of work, but it was kind of trying to help residents and tenants kind of take ownership of a situation and just be able to have negotiations with their landlords. So obviously we have welcomed the extension of the suspension of evictions. We have been lobbying and continue to lobby the Housing Minister, Robert Jenrick, and civil servants around extending that. So I guess that moves us on quite nicely into what we as a council want to see, and what are the things that we want to see as an administration, as a Labour-led administration, but also across London. I think it probably segues quite well into some of the issues that Sadiq Khan pre-lockdown mentioned at the launch of his campaign, of the mayoral and assembly election campaign, where we talked about rent controls. I know there have been discussions in various forums with the new shadow cabinet, and Thangan Debonair in particular, about the kind of interventions and controls the future Labour government would make. And so, just by way of example, we have been trying to role model some of those things. So we've been pushing for, like many other people for many years, an end to Section 21. Been doing lots of, and I just want to give a shout out to Hackney Citizens and Generation Rent, who've been complete stalwarts in providing a breadth, and actually Age UK, a breadth of a reflection of the people that are genuinely in the private rented sector here in Hackney. They very much reflect our community. They're faith groups, they are older people, young people, key workers, as now the government has finally recognised, but people that do low to middle income jobs. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is that we have been pushing for longer tenancies. So again, that is, we're pushing for that to be a legislative intervention. So Abhinav, at the point that you ever make it into the cabinet proper, when we're in government, it would really be something that boroughs would love you to do. We've made some really good progress with some registered provider landlords who have private housing stock. So we write to our agencies and we write to our landlords to say, if they are in a position to offer longer tenancies, then that is something that we would definitely welcome. We have that's slow and incremental, because we don't have all the powers that we need to be able to do that. We have, just very quickly, we have within the council a housing company, and it doesn't build, it doesn't generate, it doesn't kind of have staff or anything. Its sole purpose is to hold homes, and within that housing company we're able to do things like set our own longer tenancies, like make sure that people who move into those homes are able to afford those rents. We're able to demonstrate a professional standard, and they kind of and so the rents that we charge are very similar to the rents that the Mayor of London has set out, London living rents. So that's something that in the extended current administration and previously, it's basically a third of a local rent set by ward. And so I know that in the next year and a half, I will have 8 of these homes in my own ward, and we expect to have another, I would say 40 by the end of 2020, COVID willing, and with a target of about 500 by the end of this administration, so by 2022. And I think it's really important to kind of hang on to the benefits of that. Are we able to, as I say, provide people in the private rented sector, a cross section of people, longer term tenancies, And we also have, I guess most importantly, a rent escalator, which is kind of the beginnings of a rent control. And there is a wider discussion about a rent control and the impact of it on supply of housing. But I think in terms of the private rented sector, it's just in terms of London, where almost 2 million people, or millions of people, I can't actually, don't quote me on the number, but a lot of people are in the private rented sector, and it's affecting people's homes, people's livelihoods, people's job prospects. And just very quickly, I think within the context of Black Lives Matter and the incidents in the last week or so, and particularly around COVID, we have seen, and I think councillors are at the sharp end of this at the moment, we have seen that poor housing conditions for people are definitely a contributory factor to deaths of people. And so I'm not a scientist, I'm surmising this from my interactions with my own residents in my ward and the data that we have, but taking into account the fact that a large majority of Black and minority ethnic people in London and in North East, and the constituency that I'm seeking to represent, are from the in poor or overcrowded accommodation. They are not able to do things like socially isolate or shield because of the because of the accommodation that they live in. As Abina has said, there are people who are street homeless, who, you know, it's completely unseemly that the government is probably thinking about putting them back on the streets. Boroughs are scrabbling to find permanent accommodation for those people that the government was able to find money for overnight and try to make that into a permanent situation. But also, I think the housing policies that come forward, all of these things will obviously benefit all Londoners, but I think will have a massive impact on not just housing, but the health and well-being of the people that are in the private rented sector, and I think in the current context of BME people as well. So that's my little bit.
Well, thank you very much. And so I think now we'll move over to Rachel White, who's the one of the outreach coordinators of the London Renters Union. And yeah.
Hiya everyone, thanks for having me along. Yeah, as Philip said, I am a member of the London Renters Union. I'm in the Lewisham branch, and I am also one of the outreach coordinators. So I'll start off by telling you just a little bit about the Renters Union, and then talk about what we're seeing from our members and people we're interacting with during this crisis. So we are a member-led union that was started about 2 years ago. We have 3 branches in Hackney, one in Lewisham and one in Newham. And we have 2 emerging branches in Camden and one in Tower Hamlets. We have 3,000 members across the whole of London in every borough. And our kind of aim is to transform the housing system into one that works for renters by redressing the power balance between renters and landlords. So in normal times, renters face a really unjust system. Like, of course, we have, as Abina and Sem talked about, very high rents, low quality housing and bad housing conditions, lots of disrepair, but also a set of laws that keep renters in a precarious situation, and a system that makes it really difficult for us to access justice. So we've heard a lot about Section 21 evictions, which mean that you can get evicted for no fault of your own at a month's notice, which kind of contributes to the precariousness that renters face. And also fighting these legal processes or these kind of evictions and anything to do with your landlord is really difficult and often very scary. Things like going to court and accessing that is really difficult, often expensive. And so really, even where laws do exist, it's often hard for renters when they're on their own to access that justice. So as well as supporting individual renters, we want more kind of radical demands that would see good quality housing for everyone in London and in the UK. We do what we do by collectivizing our issues. We skill ourselves up with knowledge of the housing system, and use both our kind of like collective power and this knowledge to win justice for renters. Sometimes this is through just like very simple things like being a renter can often be a really lonely experience, and it's hard even to, like, it's a really confusing system. So even something like a WhatsApp group where you can ask people, my landlord said I have to pay this, is that right? And there's 100 other people in that WhatsApp group who've had the same problem, who can just tell you straight off the bat, no, say this. That's a really simple way that we can support one another. But also we use in kind of normal times a lot of protest and direct action to get landlords to the negotiating table. So often landlords will just like bat renters off really easily, evict them if they have any issues, or kind of just be really rude and ignore emails and letters. So we found that turning up on their doorstep and making lots of noise, or kind of protesting either online or in person, is a good way to start those negotiations and win justice for our renters and for our members. So yeah, that's the kind of how we were acting ahead or before COVID hit. When it all hit in March, or like when it kind of, when things started really kicking in March, we kind of saw instantly what a huge problem this would be for our members, just from people coming to us and like the kind of huge numbers of people coming to us with their issues. So our members lost jobs almost instantly, overnight, and I think one of our previous speakers mentioned that renters are much more likely to be in low paid and precarious work, and those are the kind of sectors that have been hit hardest by this. Many of our members haven't been eligible for any of the government schemes, either because they've kind of fallen through the net, like they're self-employed, but they've only been self-employed for 1 year or 2 years. Or a lot of our members have no recourse to public funds, which means that they can't access any benefits whatsoever, or any of the kind of furlough or self-employment schemes. And even for people who were lucky enough to get furlough, so in the areas where we have branches, the average rent is 60% of the average salary. So if your salary then gets reduced by 20%, you really don't have much money left to play with. So even if people have been able to benefit from government schemes, they still have been struggling to pay their rent. So yeah, we have these. So we have kind of two situations, mainly from our renters: either people who have no way of paying their rent, or have seen their income decrease so much that it's impossible to pay all of their rent. And on the other side is people who should be shielding, either for themselves or for their family members, but have had to go out to work because they don't have access to public funds to support them through this time. And yeah, so kind of this crisis has exacerbated all the issues that we saw before. I would say that housing is always a public health issue. Bad quality housing contributes to bad health outcomes. In the time of a pandemic, that's even more true. Some of the things that we're seeing are our members living in temporary accommodation that isn't being cleaned, and lots of kind of shared facilities and kind of shared doors and stuff that people are having to touch, and feeling really unsafe doing that. Terrible kind of damp, which of course with a kind of disease that impacts on your respiratory system is terrible. Residents with no heating, no hot water, and even a block of flats that was left without running water at all. These are conditions that in normal times are really disgusting, but in the time of pandemic, where like the main advice for people is to be washing their hands regularly, to have no running water is just shocking, really. Another massive issue that we're seeing and very worried about is the debt that renters are getting themselves into or will be getting themselves into. People either borrowing money to pay their rent, or using rent repayment or agreeing rent repayment plans with their landlords. So even if people do go back to the full jobs that they had before on the same hours, earning the same amount of money, if their rent was 60% of their income, it's going to be very difficult for them to pay anything on top of that, to pay back that debt. And of course, there's no guarantee that these jobs, that people will go back to the same jobs that they had before, or the same hours at the same pay. So yeah, we're really worried about the rent that people will be accruing through this crisis. And yeah, the government did ban evictions at the beginning of this crisis, which was really welcome. And I'm sure you've all seen that they've just been extended for another. The eviction ban has just been extended for another 2 months, which is good. But at the same time, there's still illegal evictions going on. We've prevented quite a few, and we know that there are, if we've prevented a few, then we know that there are others that we're not reaching. We've had huge issues with lodgers, particularly at the beginning of this crisis, who have even fewer rights than other renters, just being kicked out kind of overnight by the people that they're lodging with. And ultimately, this eviction ban kind of just pushes the evictions crisis further down the road, 5 months now down the road. Yeah, of course, people will have built up rent debt, and it's likely that as soon as the courts open back up, or as soon as the ban is lifted, landlords will be evicting in the hundreds and thousands. Yeah. So what are we doing to address this? Well, we launched a campaign called Can't Pay, Won't Pay a few weeks ago. And this campaign is bringing together renters who can't pay their rent. We're doing what we do best, which is to educate and support one another to stand up to our landlords. So at the moment, this is bringing in people and encouraging them to negotiate a lower rent payment throughout the crisis with their landlords, or to support one another if they're not paying rent, and also skilling up on how to resist evictions if and when they do start back up again. We're also calling on the government to do 5 things. So we want them to suspend rent during this period, so that renters don't have to stress about paying rent whilst it's really difficult for them to get income in order to pay it. We want all rent debt to be cancelled, so for no renter to accrue any debt at this time. We want the evictions ban made permanent, so we want all evictions banned for 1 year, at least 1 year, and we want Section 21 evictions banned permanently. We want to end borders in housing, which would mean that there's no migration checks in housing, and that everyone has access to public funds. And we also kind of, our final demand is looking at implementing rent controls. We want to come out of this crisis being able to build a better world for renters. And so we're aiming to, what we'd like to see is rent controls that mean that no renter has to pay more than 30% of their income on their rent. We're really keen to have direct conversations with councils. So for example, we, as well as wanting to build a mass campaign that includes every renter across London, we're also kind of staying rooted in the areas that our branches are in. We have strong links with those councils, or we've kind of had sometimes interesting links, but we know these areas very well, and we do have links with councils there. For example, in Lewisham, we've been meeting regularly with the council to talk about the situation in temporary accommodation there, and also to talk about how we will be resisting evictions, as the council is very aware that these will be coming down the line. Sam, our Hackney branch, would love to get talking with you about the problems that Hackney's private renters are facing and will be facing soon, and how we can go about solving them together.
Yeah, no, I mean, it would be very welcome. As I said at the beginning, I've met quite a few groups and we've done work with a few groups. So it'd be really great to finally meet somebody from LRU. So
cool,
yeah.
Great. So yeah, obviously what we can do together, as in renters and our members, what we can do together at the moment is limited, because usually we're kind of out on the streets protesting, meeting face to face, and yeah, that's kind of how we organise Obviously, that's all had to move online, and it's much more difficult for us to like be out in the streets at the moment. But we're thinking about safe ways that we can take action and ways that we can reach, as always, like the worst off renters in London. So yeah, that's what we're doing. If you're a renter, please join the union and join our campaign. If you're a CLP member and you're interested in working, interested in kind of like supporting Build the campaign, we're kind of trying to work out at the moment how some specific ways that Labour CLPs can support. So yeah, just like drop me a message in the chat and yeah, let's talk. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Now our last speaker before we go into a sort of discussion. Also, I realise the breakout rooms isn't labelled. I don't know for what reason. Maybe we don't pay enough for them. But anyway, we'll still have the discussions. Just we've just in a different form. But our last speaker is Anya Martin from Priced Out, and who'll sort of give us a more sort of data. I don't know how to describe it. View of what's happening.
Thank you. Yeah, so thanks very much for having me. I'm really happy to be here. Really excited to be invited onto such a good panel as well. So I am Anya Martin. I'm the head of policy and research at Priced Out. Priced Out is England's campaign for affordable house prices. Sorry to anyone outside of England, but we don't have a Scottish, Welsh or Northern Irish Priced Out yet. We essentially call for action from government to reduce the cost of homes to buy and to rent. We fight for anyone who is priced out of the type of housing that they want, where they want to live. So I thought I'd kind of look at the main issues at the moment that we're seeing and then go on to some of the policy measures that we'd like to see introduced to deal with them. The others have already pointed to this. The main issue is affordability in London. We all know that London rents are obscene. We've had decades of undersupply. We've failed to build enough homes for London's growing population, which has resulted in a very vicious circle of house price inflation and speculative behaviour from landlords, which then, goes round in circles. We've had a vast reduction in the supply of social housing. So that jointly means that between the people who would have bought a home before and then left the private rented sector and the people that would have been allocated to social housing before, these people aren't leaving the private rented sector, and as a result it's more than doubled in the last 20 years, from 2 million people around the time of the millennium to 4.5 million in England today. London has especially driven this because the rents are so high. They can easily cover half a household's income, even more in some cases. So the situation is that rents were already biting, they were already too high, and they're biting even more now. Private renters are more likely to be in affected jobs such as hospitality that have all had to close down. They're more likely to lose their incomes, and they were facing higher housing costs to begin with. Resolution Foundation estimates that 1 in 8 private renters have fallen behind on their rent already, and many more to do so in the future if they aren't able to start working again. Citizens Advice thinks that across the UK, 2.6 million renters are at risk of falling into arrears. So what that obviously leaves us with is the risk of evictions. Private renters have very, very few protections from eviction in England anyway. England is very unusual amongst European countries in that it permits no fault evictions, so you can be evicted by your landlord, generally with 2 months notice through no fault of your own. Now, as we know, government has introduced this temporary ban on evictions with no court processes permitted until August. And we shouldn't deny that this is welcome. It's a stay of execution, but it's a stay of execution. We obviously have a lot of tenants falling into arrears, though, from which they may struggle to recover over the long term, and very little protection for them at the end of that period. The others have talked about issues around homelessness. There are also other things like difficulty moving house at the moment, issues with co-tenants leaving, and the potential risk of replacing them. And then for renters who are living in houses of multiple occupation, so sharing with other households, they're at a much higher risk of infection. They may be put in awkward positions where they, have housemates who are not necessarily abiding by the lockdown and could be putting them at risk as well. So basically, we have the private rented sector is a very, very bad place to be in general, and it's especially bad now. I could probably rant about this all day, but in terms of the solutions to it, the two main goals that we are interested in Priced Out is, first of all, ensuring that renters do not fall behind on their rent, they do not fall into arrears, and they do not get evicted. And secondly, to ensure that landlords bear as much of the costs of this crisis as possible. Renters have no choice but to rent. But landlords have made an investment, they've chosen to come into this market, and that investment has gone south. It's only fair that they lose out, not their renters. The problem is these two goals are somewhat in opposition, because while some landlords can take a hit, others can't. Some will default on their mortgages, and as a result will have to evict their tenants at the end of this period. Now, we have absolutely no problem with landlords leaving the market. In fact, we encourage it, but we don't really want a mass exodus at once, especially in a situation when renters are already financially vulnerable. So the policy measures that we would like to see introduced, first and foremost, sorting out the welfare system. The point of the welfare system is to be there to help you when you are in need, and now is a time of need. Primarily, we think the most important solution would be increasing the local housing allowance. So that's the amount of housing benefit or universal credit that you can get towards your housing costs to the 50th percentile of market rents. So that would cover the lower half of properties. Government has already increased it to the 30th, which was a huge improvement on the situation before, when very few houses in London were affordable. In some areas, there were literally no houses that were affordable on housing benefit or universal credit. So this would mean that most renters who lose income would have most of their rent covered. However, as Rachel has pointed out, there's a lot of people who are have no recourse to public funds, and that needs to be addressed, at least for this period. We have to get rid of the idea that people should not be supported by the state. You know, they don't have any choice right now. We need to support them. And then on the eviction side, as the others have already said, we need to end Section 21, this no-fault eviction. The government had already promised to do this. They had been sitting on their hands for some time. We still don't know what the timescale is for this. And I think most importantly, that needs to be introduced quickly, but it needs to be introduced quickly without loopholes. And in particular, there's the issue of rent increases that could be used to de facto evict people. If there's no limitations on within tenancy increases in rent, then your landlord could simply put your rent up to an unaffordable level and cause you to leave, even without evicting you. So government needs to make sure it closes that, and it needs to do so as soon as it can. And then the other point is reforming Section 8 evictions. That's Ground 8 evictions. That's the ground for rent arrears. Currently, if you have, I believe it's 2 months rent arrears and you go to court, that's a mandatory ground for the eviction. The court has no choice but to evict you. We want to make that discretionary and give courts the flexibility to not evict people for falling into arrears because of COVID. And that would obviously give people some time. And then lastly, there's this issue of arrears that have been gained over this period. So this was quite a difficult issue because of essentially the European Convention on Human Rights, which states that you can't essentially deprive landlords of their property rights, which means that you can't just essentially cancel the rent for a certain period. Our proposal tries to strike a balance by asking government to pass legislation that says where renters have accrued arrears above the local housing allowance, these can be written off. So that effectively means for half of properties, the full rent can be covered by the welfare system. And for properties that are more expensive than that, where tenants may be accumulating arrears even if they are paying the full allowance, these properties would get what we're calling a rent haircut for the duration of the crisis. Anything above the LHA cap would be disregardable if the tenant couldn't afford it, and landlords would then have to absorb that cost. We think this strikes a good balance of dealing with long-term issues around welfare and evictions, pushes the cost of the crisis from renters onto landlords, and unlike a kind of blanket rent cancellation policy, it's legally implementable and would also be quite hard for landlords to dispute in court over the long run. So those are a few of the things that we would like to see. We have got a lot of information on Priced Out's website, so do go and have a look, get involved. We're always looking for volunteers as well. I'm sure you all have plenty of opinions about the housing crisis, just like we do. So it'd be good to have more friendly faces around the table. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. That was very informative. So I guess because we won't be able to do the breakout session, I guess we can just move on to a sort of more traditional Q&A session, I guess. So I guess if does everyone know how the raising your hand thing works on Zoom? If you'd like to ask any of the panelists a question, yeah, raise your hand. It should be somewhere on the. Yeah, actually, you know what? I'll let Omar speak so he can explain, because I don't know. So Omar, yeah, please.
Hi, hello. So just in terms of the mechanics of raising your hand on this, I think you need to click on participants, and then at the bottom of that, there's an option to raise your hand. So my question was about rent cancellation, and I'm the BAME officer for Open London Labour, but I'm also vice chair of the Society of Labour Lawyers, and so personally, I'm supportive of rent cancellation. But I know Thangham has raised concerns about legal issues, and there's quite a few legal commentators have said that there are potential issues with the contravening the Human Rights Act and the European Convention for Human Rights. And I was wondering, what the panelists have done on that. Specifically, one of the issues is that potentially a blanket cancellation is more likely to contravene the European Convention on Human Rights, but something more targeted might be less likely to. And I was wondering, what kind of your views are on the legal situation, particularly for Sam, whether Hackney Council has looked into this at all and taken a view on the legal side, and what your response to people who say that there are legal issues with rent cancellation is.
I see Jackie wants to ask a question as well.
Yeah, I did have a couple of questions. I just can't remember them. The first one actually was about the company that's been set up in Hackney to rent to tenants, which I assume is effectively an arm's length company that's operating as a private landlord, so it's letting on short hold tenancies. Is that right? And if so, I just wondered why Hackney's decided to give longer term tenancies rather than indefinite tenancies.
Okay, shall I answer those?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, so on rent cancellation, so I started at the beginning by saying that Hackney has about 20% of the social stock, or the housing stock rather, in the borough belongs to Hackney Council. So we as a council are a landlord. And so I'm not aware that we have taken advice around rent cancellations. I think what we are looking for is, as Anya talked about, we have in our borough only 3% of the private rented sector, which is affordable to us. So we source temporary accommodation in the private sector, and people will be looking for homes there. We as a borough cannot afford that. I think what is preferable in terms of looking at the whole system is to really encourage people to put efforts behind making sure that more of the borough is affordable, to bring rents and wages back into line. I've mentioned that 50% increase in rents, which is just through the roof. People's wages need to be able to match their rents. I think there are massive implications for a council that owns stock and as a landlord itself on changes around rents and rent cancellation. Just by way of example, I think our my numbers might be slightly off, but I think our 3-month rent roll on our social housing stock. So this is people that are paying, the generally affordable rents, is about 35 million. And there is a balance between all of that money pays for people who work for the council and keep the borough going, and housing officers, cleaners, direct labour organisation, all those sorts of things. And to be blunt, if we have no money coming in as a landlord, we have no services. And that's kind of offsetting, all of those people that we support as a Labour administration. I'm not aware that we have looked into what the implications would be in the private rented sector. We are looking for an equivalence between somebody who's in the social sector who gets in an ideal world, people in this private rented sector, it'd be my dream, would get an indefinite tenancy and then move when they want to. But we need to start from somewhere. And so the 3 years is something that we've been campaigning for. And I think I remember back when Ed Miliband was leader, we went into that general election with that as a campaign ask, and we worked that really here in Hackney. And we spoke to people that live here, that work here, and that seemed to work quite well. So that is something that we are trying to demonstrate. And so to your point, Jackie, about the housing company, there are some bits that I actually missed out. So the housing company, it's not at arm's, so there are different models of how local authorities will have either build new homes or hold the stock that they have. So hold the existing homes and manage them. So our housing company is not arm's length, it's wholly owned by the council. It doesn't have any, as I said, it doesn't have any staff or anything like that. Its sole purpose is to buy properties back from the build program that we have. I'm going to probably get into a bit of development here. So we build our own homes, and at times, and that money is built using money from our housing revenue account and as loaned to us and from other sources. So we got money from Sadiq Khan a year and a half ago, about £100 million to build out genuinely affordable housing. So one of the things that we can do with, rather than build, we are able to build more social housing in our existing pipeline. So build more council homes that we're going to rent out for council levels at a later stage. And we're able to, a council cannot, the housing company, the benefit of the housing company is that if it can buy property, a council cannot buy property in quite the same way. The company buys effectively from the council's build programme, and then those homes are then still council owned homes. I guess the key thing is that we are not allowed to offer indefinite tenancies, is the short answer to your question, Jackie. And then the second thing is that one of the benefits of the company is that beyond that, you can, there is no reason why people rent out on ASTs, it's just that people do, if I'm honest. To my mind, it's well within the law as it stands to offer longer tenancies if a landlord wants to. We have some registered providers who are offering homes at 3 years, 5 years, longer here in Hackney, and they are renting privately, but they understand that it doesn't make sense for them financially because they're a larger landlord to keep going with kind of deciding whether or not to boot somebody out year to year. It doesn't make financial sense for them. And so with the company, we're able to at least try and set a baseline within the borough to say, this is what we expect. And it also helps us support our lobbying work with people like the Residential Landlords Association and the National Landlords Association, who we try to convince them that if we can demonstrate as a borough that this works, you still get your monies coming in, we're able to rent those properties at a third of local incomes at Hackney living rents, which kind of demonstrates basically what a private rented sector should look like. And because those rents are set lower than an arbitrary market level, we're able to offer homes to people based on an average income. So I guess one of the things which is also probably, we had long discussions about this, we in our housing company, we don't, for example, have a key worker policy. We have an income-based policy because until recently, a cleaner was not a key worker in the eyes of the government. And in the National Planning Policy Framework, the people that we all know here in this call are key workers are not considered key workers. So somebody who's earning, the idea is that somebody who is, for example, an apprentice in Hackney earning a living wage can afford one of those living rent homes, which is owned by the council. But the final thing is, yeah, it's protected from right to buy. So one of the things that all boroughs have suffered from is that you build something the minute something goes up, you hand over keys to somebody and it is subject to right to buy. And I think it is also a way for us to remain within the law as it stands right now, but to be able to offer those homes for longer periods of time. Now, in practice, most larger landlords who offer the shorter tenancies, if a household circumstances have not changed, we haven't got to that stage yet because Just Let homes, it's very much a pilot situation, we will not be throwing people out. But it also gives people the flexibility that if they do need to move or want to move, they are able to do so in a way which is probably a bit easier than the social housing sector at the moment, where there aren't really the vacancies for them to move on to different properties. I hope that makes sense. Does that cover everything? Yeah.
Thank you. And do Rachel or Anya, do you want to come in on any of those questions?
Yeah, actually, just on the point about kind of rent cancellation, I think you made the point quite rightly. Really, there's concerns about the blanket policy, in that it. I say this very reluctantly because I would, of course, love to see the rent cancelled, but. And as I said, one of our main priorities is shifting the burden of the crisis onto landlords. But a blanket cancellation of rent, it would be a violation of the European Convention on Human Rights, specifically the right to property, which includes income from agreed contracts. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do it. As a government, you can kind of do anything, but it means that landlords would be able to dispute it in court, and they will win almost certainly. And that would mean that the state would have to compensate them for it. So it would essentially lead us to a few problems. Firstly, the landlords would be bailed out and the cost ultimately shunted onto the taxpayer and indeed to tenants. Their tenants may well be liable too, so they could end up being bitten by this in the long run. And then even assuming it was feasible, there are several issues with it. So firstly, it's a one-off policy. It cancels the rent for a certain period. But there are several welfare reforms that we've been battling on for years. Other people have listed them as well. So the increasing the LHA, scrapping the benefit cap, scrapping the bedroom tax. There's a whole host of them. So I think this is a really, really good opportunity to get those through now, and make those difference for the long run, and the same for evictions as well. And then another issue with it is that government, they would never do it. It's not something that this government is ever going to implement, and priced out. What we want to do is call for things that they may well actually do. So you can make the argument that it's something that's worth arguing for, that's something worth changing the kind of setting of the debate. But I think right now we have a good opportunity to build a real coalition within the kind of housing campaign world, and in the policy world, the political world. Shelter, Priced Out, Generation Rent, and others are all pushing for these reforms to welfare and eviction right now. So it would be very, very good for everyone to get behind that coalition.
Thanks. Rachel, do you want to say anything about this?
Yeah, I have to say I don't really have much to add. I was unaware of the European Convention of Human Rights challenge to that. I guess, yeah, yeah, and we haven't done a huge amount of thinking on the legal side. We are just for a kind of cancellation of all rent, and a kind of blanket cancellation so that no renters are left out. And what we see constantly is means tested systems, or like systems with so many barriers to them, which often leaves people locked out of or like kind of leaves people falling through the net. Most often migrants, most often people of colour, most often kind of working people, and the people that disabled people, the people at the sharpest end of all policies, which is why we support something that's much more blanket. So yeah, that's my point on that. Thanks.
Could I add one final thing just to build on that?
Sure.
Okay, so a few weeks ago, we did a housing scrutiny, obviously our public meeting where we speak to backbenchers and they interrogate delivery on policy, and we were looking at the private rented sector and what will happen. And so I suppose the difference between maybe me and my colleagues is that obviously we are all dealing right now with COVID as it stands, but the biggest fear that we have, and having spoken to officers all right across London, I think no borough, including the City of London, although its stock is outside of the City of London, but no borough director is not concerned about what happens when that moratorium ends on private renting, on evictions. And part of the reason, so the extended period where people are not going to have eviction notices served on them is helpful in the sense that we have had a lull in people coming forward, kind of, unlike at the beginning, people were really, really worried, and then they found other avenues. Like they have found, the council website has been updated, there's somewhere for them to go. There are places like LRU or other groups that support people here locally to find out what their rights and responsibilities are. But on the day that the evictions ban is lifted, it feels like we're going to be hit with just a wall of people. And so I think from a borough perspective, the work around making sure that if and when that happens, if we were able to afford more than 3% of our homes in our own borough, where we are the biggest landowner and the biggest landlord, then we wouldn't have a problem. We would still have a problem, but we would not have to worry so much about placing people who may lose their homes. If between now and the evictions ban being lifted, we are able to get people who have never had any interaction with the housing benefits and housing needs system, get them to engage with that now, because we know what happened at the beginning of the crisis, then we're able to protect people and keep them in their homes. And I suppose it's about as much about campaigning, but it's also about making sure that, at least in Hackney's position, a third of our borough are potentially at risk of being homeless at the end of the at the end of the evictions ban. Now, I know most of those people are doing okay in terms of paying rents, but there are going to be other things as a result of COVID that will impact them, that will mean that they are struggling. And so, can't stress enough how central it is to reform local housing allowance and make boroughs affordable and homes affordable to councils, to their own councils, so we can support people. And at the same time, we can continue the other wider reforms, and all of those things can happen in train.
Thanks. And now Rachel, and then we'll have a question from Rachel Ward and then Lee.
Yeah, so my question's about kind of what you predict would happen to the rental market and what the impact of people defaulting on their rent will be, because so obviously lots of people have spoken about there'll be like this wave of evictions and stuff. And I get that there'll be all these landlords that have been basically delaying evictions that they wanted to do, and that they'll get them done as soon as they can because they just really want to evict them. But in the kind of wider scheme of things, if only 44% of people were able to pay their rent over the COVID period, then if a landlord evicts their tenant because they didn't pay their rent on time, or they can't pay the full amount, there's surely not going to be this massive pool of people who can step in. And so I just wondered what you kind of think the mechanics of that is, and whether that'll see rent prices eventually kind of like decrease, whether it'll mean that more people try and sell. Will that mean that house prices go down? Does that present an opportunity for councils to step in and buy properties at a lower rate? And yeah, I guess some of the kind of like more medium to long term impacts of this.
Thanks, and then Lee.
So I just had a question for Anya actually about the legal things around cancelling rent. So just to kind of say, I'm also a member of the London Renters Union as well, and so actually this is something I've been working with Rachel on. And so in terms of the cancelling the rent, is there a way you can get around that? In terms of the legal aspect at the European level, is there a way you can get around that by making sort of cancelling the rent for renters, but making a discretionary payment for landlords actually need it, because there'll be a lot of landlords that just profit from the system rather than actually need that income. So I guess that would be my because obviously that's one of the LRU's demands. So it's like, cancelling rent. So I guess it's a legal way around that from the UK level, that makes sure the landlords that need that income get it still, and you're still able to cancel the rent.
And actually, I'd like to ask a question as well, specifically to Sam about more about what the Mayor of London or the GLA, what powers does Sadiq or the GLA as a whole have in terms of being able to deal not just with the housing crisis, and that actually no, let's keep it just with the housing crisis during the coronavirus. So who would like to answer first?
Yeah, I can answer the first two actually. So I'll do Rachel's question first, and then I'll go on to Lee's. I think you're right that we probably can expect rents to fall and house prices to fall in London. One of the main drivers of rents, in addition to the supply of homes and the affordability of those homes, is people's income. So you will see that if incomes are increasing, then rents will increase unless you increase supply accordingly. So given that incomes are falling and that a lot of people won't be able to afford their rent, may potentially be evicted, and there will be fewer alternatives for landlords to get into those properties, I think it's quite reasonable to expect that rents will fall. I think we're seeing it already actually. It's a little hobby of mine, going on Rightmove and watching the you can see when properties are reduced. Recently that they have been dropping. I've seen some insane falls in the area where I live, for instance. So yeah, I think probably rents will fall. I don't know how long that will last. It obviously depends on the wider economic recovery, which does mean, of course, that there are going to be winners and losers, because if you manage to maintain your income during this period as a private renter, you might have also seen that your living costs have fallen because you're not having to commute and things like that. And you may see that your rent falls, or you're able to negotiate a cheaper rent. And actually, if you are a renter, it's worth having a go, to be honest, at the moment. Or you can move into a cheaper property if you find one available. So those people may actually see a benefit from this, but obviously there's going to be all of the people that have lost their income and they can't afford their rent. So the overall average is going to be not an improvement in affordability, but there will be winners and losers from that, I think. And the same with house prices. House prices are in part determined by landlords' ability to get rent from that property. And if that amount of rent you can achieve is lower, then the price will fall. Again, there's winners and losers from that, basically. And then on Lee's question, I think it is a very good point, and it's something that we've been thinking about a great deal, whether we can kind of get around that. I don't know about discretionary payments so much. I'm not sure if that would necessarily. I'm not sure if the kind of legal point that matters is whether they can sustain it, because I think it's more like a right to have the property. But one of the proposals that we put forward that we thought might kind of address that was this idea that I kind of mentioned briefly earlier of rent haircuts. So we thought that if with the LHA increased to the 50th percentile of the market rent, we could try and get government to pass legislation that says that if someone has accumulated arrears above that level, so assuming they've lost their income, they get their local housing allowance, say it doesn't fully cover their rent, the additional amount that they were unable to pay because they didn't receive enough housing benefit or universal credit, we thought that could potentially be disregarded, because it doesn't target all landlords in the same way. Only essentially it gives the rent a haircut, we're calling it. So it's not a kind of blanket thing, and we think that might be more arguable in court. I'm not a lawyer, I don't know for sure, I haven't had a lawyer looking at this, but we certainly think that it would be more disputable than the kind of blanket policy. So it might be something that is possible, and it's something we think government should look at, and we've had a few other kind of organisations in the housing sector calling for that. So I don't think it's impossible. just don't know how easy it is. And obviously a lot of the risks here is that we may not know whether it's legal until it goes to court, until it goes to a test case. So in that situation, I think the best thing that we can do is focus on welfare and things like that, that we know definitely will work. If we are trying something experimental, okay, try it by all means. I'd love to see rents reduced, and I'd love to see that cost shunted onto landlords. But we have to accept that it may well come back to bite in court, and in that case, then it would have to be subsidised by the state if the state loses. So it's coming out of our pockets yet again. Oh, I'm sorry, I've actually got to shoot off now, but thank you all. It's been really interesting, and please do take a look at our website.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just because we'll have to wrap up soon, does anyone have just a final questions for very quick though, for Sam or Rachel? Yeah, Jackie, go on.
Yeah, I mean, we've been focusing this meeting understandably on the private rented sector because it's the tenants who are most immediately affected. But I think we need to be a bit bolder and look a bit longer term in terms of what the Labour Party should be asking for. And basically, there should not be so many private tenants on lower incomes or vulnerable in the private rented sector. They are only there because of an gross inadequacy of social housing. So I really would like to see this group and the Labour Party as a whole campaigning for a massive increase in social housing development. And it makes economic sense. It stimulates the economy. It produces thousands of jobs. And, you know, at the end of the day, private landlords are private landlords. They're not social landlords. And yet, because of the lack of social housing, we expect them to behave like social landlords, and they're not, and they never will be. And that's why if somebody doesn't pay, you know, they want the maximum rent they can get. And if somebody can't pay it, they want to evict them to get somebody else. That's a business, you know. And so I just think we should all be campaigning as hard as we can to push this government into reforming, relaxing the borrowing rules, giving local authorities far more money to actually start seriously building social housing at rents that a normal person can afford.
Can I quickly come back on that? And actually, I'll try and very quickly respond to Rachel, but that's just more of a personal opinion rather than any knowledge base around what will happen to the housing market. But so Jackie, I probably will start off a little bit controversially. Will say that I agree with you up to a point. I agree that we need to have a ton more social housing being built in London. So Tom Copley was in front of the select committee the other day talking about how the amount of money that Sadiq Khan has to build housing in London for the full duration of the term, of the 4-year term, is what could be spent very easily per year to just keep up with demand. So just using a Hackney example, we have 13,000 people on our waiting list. And I just think, with the best will in the world, we have a very big build program as far as councils are concerned. With the best will in the world, we cannot solely build our way out of the housing crisis. We also do need to massively reform the private rented sector. And I feel like it's not either or, because I think people are living in the private rented sector. People are now growing old in the private rented sector, where once upon a time they would have moved into sheltered accommodation. We simply don't have that housing. So whilst people are living their lives, I don't think it's right and fair for the Labour Party to expect people to wait for something that will take years, decades, possibly longer to happen. I think we absolutely need to commit to, full square behind building social housing, but people in the private rented sector should have, as a minimum, the same basic levels of protection that their counterparts in the social rented sector do have. Because if that was the case, my job in the cabinet wouldn't exist, and you wouldn't need a London Renters Union, because people would have those rights and protections under the law, but they don't have that. So I think if we're able, so if somebody your original question about longer tenancies, it would be a dream if everybody in the private rented sector had that right, but we can start from, at a minimum, offering 3 years and pushing for that, because that is something that doesn't require the law to change. we do need to continue to push for more funding. But given that how difficult it was to squeeze that money out to give to Sadiq Khan, who's a Labour mayor asking a Conservative housing secretary who has poisoned the well on the London plan just before the COVID-19 shutdown, went out of his way to make a very partisan point about how we didn't agree with that London plan and our housing need as a city. It is an uphill battle. So I think we basically need to fight on all fronts, and we need to support people as they are living now, with the view to making sure that we are building those homes as well. And I think there is so much work there that every single campaigning group will be fighting on different fronts, but just kind of having that unity of purpose that we need to protect private renters because they have no protections. And also we need to make sure that we are building the social housing so that people aren't living in the private rented sector when they shouldn't be or don't need to be. But you know, if we as Hackney Council were able to build 20,000 homes, 13,000 homes a year, we'd be able to house everybody for year one. It still would have, that doesn't resolve the issue of an unregulated private rented sector. And then just really quickly, I think that sort of touches on my point about Rachel, what I think would happen in the rental market. Because of the dysfunctionality of the housing market as a whole, I think we as a borough, in order to make sure that those people are the people that live here in the private sector, that work here, all the rest of it, take their kids to school here, we need, it's now imperative that our private rented sector works properly and supports the people that live in it, and landlords have respect for the people that live in it and are not, the people that live in it are not just seen as cash cows to those people. And I don't think it's the end of the world to ask for certain basic protections. Having said that, because there are so few legal fallbacks for tenants and for us to enforce as a council beyond landlord licensing, it's a difficult line to tread where if every landlord evicted everybody, you'd have 34,000 homeless households. And so I think we just need to, I don't know how to fix that problem. I mean, there are bigger brains in this call and out in the Labour Party than mine, but I think that is not it doesn't feel like an unsolvable problem. But I think starting with a combination of, as Jackie says, building homes at pace and at speed to restart the economy and to house people who are on our waiting list, but also those people that are in the private rented sector, to make sure that they have basic standards and rights and are able to kind of put down roots and not have to be shuffling every 2 years. And one of the worst things I've ever had to do was one of my residents, who's a member actually, 84, and his landlord served notice on him. I mean, first of all, the fact that he's living in the private rented sector is a reflection of the fact that there's no housing for older people in the social sector, but he is lucky enough to be in a position where he knows that how to navigate the council and what levers he can pull. They're not legal, they're not actually right, but sometimes a letter from a councillor helps, sort of a thing. But that should be just that should just be at a baseline that people should expect, same as you would if you owned your house. Yeah. Sorry, rant over.
No, it's very important. I actually, Pani raised his hand. Is it a quick question? Because we got.
I was just gonna sort of make a couple of points.
2 minutes, because we've got to wrap up soon.
So I was going to say, with the government, when you've got someone like Robert Jenrick, who approves schemes from his friends who are donating however much money to, I think it was £12,000 Richard Desmond donated in exchange for getting his scheme fast-tracked, it's almost impossible to work within that system. However, I would add, I'm not fully comfortable with cancelling the rent on all properties, just purely because there are so many landlords who are like smaller landlords, many of whom are retired, who it's a main source of income for them. So I think in those cases, I think it's probably better that the government does subsidise them, if that makes sense. I know that's probably a difference of opinion to what a few people have, but that's just sort of my thoughts. I think obviously tenants need more rights. Section 21 needs to be scrapped. Longer tenancies, more rights for tenants. and sort of a more unified Section 106 agreement between London boroughs, so people trying to build new homes know what they're dealing with. Yeah.
Thanks. Yes. Rachel, do you want to respond to anything that's been said, and
yeah,
then we can
my quick thoughts on like those last 3 points. So Rachel's question on will the situation be better for renters because there's fewer of us? I think like yes, it's possible. Anecdotally, we're seeing a lot of our members moving outside of London. They're young people, they've lost their jobs, they just like, you know, they've moved back in with their parents, or they've moved to towns that are cheaper. As why would you stay in London if you can't go out and do anything and you're paying skyrocket rents? I think that this has the potential to bring rents down. What we really don't want to see, what I certainly don't want to see, is a situation where that just means that loads more people are claiming local housing allowance, which is then going into landlords' pockets. Like that is just the state massively subsidising landlords, and that's not what we want to see. I mean, housing benefit and local housing allowance, I think, are a kind of, well, local housing allowance is, in my mind, a terrible thing in the first place, and for it to be increased is not what we want to see. One of our kind of long-term demands, though it doesn't feature in our Can't Pay Won't Pay campaign, but one of our long-term demands is that councils should be given the right to purchase, compulsory purchase property from landlords. I know that they do have this right in certain conditions, but basically if landlords' properties aren't making them money anymore, and I know that so many of them are on such tight margins, even though they charge skyrocket rents, that because they're in so much debt from like rubbish mortgages and stuff, like if they're no longer making any money off them, then rather than what Anya and others have suggested would happen, is that they just evict their tenants and then these houses lay empty. Why not the council buy them up and keep those tenants in there and subsequently like fix up the property so they're actually ready, fit to live in? And that kind of touches on Jackie and Sem's points around like, well, it takes time to build housing, but at the same time, there's already a lot of housing that people are living in. It's just that it's rubbish and it's unaffordable. So I guess there's a way of coming at the problem from a different angle, which is let's try and get rid of some of the private landlords. They can't afford it, we can't afford it. You know, I think that would work for everyone. On Penny's point about landlords, you know, protecting their income because they're living off of it. Like, I get it. I don't want any landlord to starve or be made homeless. But I do think, I mean, it's one of the messed up things about the whole renting system in the UK, right, is that you encourage people, instead of like having a good pension, to stick it into a buy-to-let property and use young people as a cash cow, or older people, or people who haven't been lucky enough to get on the ladder. Like, to me, that is a broken system that doesn't work for anyone, because when that investment goes down, that person then, you know, loses their ability to live. I think NEF had quite a good policy on this, which is what we would, I guess, support if we did see cancellation of rent, which is that any landlord who needs it could apply for some sort of benefit. So like either universal credit or something maybe specially made for landlords, so that they've got something they can live on, but so that their profit isn't being topped up. And I think that that's one of the issues that we, like the kind of moral issue that we have with this crisis, is that when we're talking about rent, we're talking about profit, and we're topping up, we're like, landlords are expecting to keep all of their profit despite the fact that everyone else is suffering. And you know, I don't really like bringing morals into the debate, but I do think it's wrong that people still expect a profit when so many other people are suffering. So yeah, there's my like final thoughts on the renting system. Thanks.
Right, fantastic. Thanks. I think I speak for everyone on I said it's a very, like, the speakers have been fantastic, and actually a really broad range of perspectives and, you know, stuff I'd never considered before. So I'd like to thank Rachel and Sam. You guys were really stellar, and hopefully, you know, when we're allowed to go door knocking again, we can go door knock for Sam and
57 awards.
50. Oh well, we can do some of them, but maybe not all of them. And you know, when hopefully we can London Open Labour and Open Labour nationally can. I really hope we can do more stuff with the London Renters Union, because you guys have really you've really got a good organisation going. You know, we wish you all the best. And yeah, I think sorry, I just need to. Okay, yes, we're done. So thanks everyone for your for coming, and yeah, stay in touch for more Open Labour London events.
Everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.